Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man exploring the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this is another instalment in our long-running deep dive into Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog, the Irish-themed fantasy adventure series from Saban Entertainment, best known for making Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. This is episode 11 of that show, Dragon's Fury. After the pleasant madness of the last episode, which featured all manner of bizarre plot points, I am very saddened to have to tell you that something awful has happened. Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog has turned out an episode which is fine. Maeve has a dastardly plan, stuff happens, the Mystic Knights save the day. It's just a solidly competent 20 minutes of kids' TV. This sort of thing is terrible for a critic because stuff that's middle of the road is so much harder to write about than stuff that's either dreadful or amazing, or ideally some wonderful combination of both. Forgettable is the one truly unforgivable sin in media as far as I'm concerned. One of the reasons why I'm drawn to the weird and the obscure is it tends to be media that hasn't been worn smooth by a succession of corporate decisions aimed at delivering the safest possible outcome. I stopped watching Marvel movies in general because they turned into a homogeneous mass of undifferentiated content. Much of it is perfectly enjoyable content, but by this point I find very little of it actually interesting. I miss the days when Ang Lee was told to make an Incredible Hulk movie and turned out a film about a man's rotten relationship with his father with the Hulk smash stuff grudgingly slapped on top of it. That, to me, is an interesting movie. It's actually fairly impressive that Mystic Knights has taken a full 11 episodes to deliver something that feels this workmanlike. One of the appealing things to me about the show is the interplay between scripts that feel like a second draft at absolute best and the rock-bottom production values, which struggle to translate the writer's often incoherent vision into a visual reality. Episodes have varied between having far more plot than they can reasonably cover in 20 minutes and having too little so that they have to come up with weird things for the characters to do to fill in the time. Dragon's Fury, by contrast, ticks along with the consistency of a metronome, delivering plot points exactly on schedule. It's a good example of a highly functional script that lacks any real personality to make it stand out. The events of Dragon's Fury broadly make sense, which is another departure for the series. Sure, there's the odd moment here or there when things take an odd turn, but overall, everything pans out in a fashion that is logic adjacent at the very least. Let's have a closer look at the plot, and I'll try and explain precisely why this episode feels a bit disappointing to me, despite being arguably the most competently executed actual story we've seen so far. We open on the aftermath of a battle lost, and a voiceover from Barry Cassin, who plays Cahad the Druid. The soldiers of Kells are trudging glumly across a field while Bazza tells us that the war against Queen Maeve's warriors of Temra is going badly. This is a little bit confusing in that Queen Maeve was distinctly struggling last week and nothing happened in that episode to indicate an improvement in her military situation. Kells still has the Mystic Knights and an actual dragon, so I can only assume that in the interval between the episodes there must have been a series of truly epic military blunders on the part of King Conovar. It would have been nice to have seen those epic military blunders on screen, but I suppose it would have undermined Conovar's status as the main authority figure if we'd seen him leading his men in a daring midnight sortie straight off a cliff. Barry also lets us know that the people of Kells have been immensely cheered by the arrival of the legendary warrior Draganta and the dragon Pyre. This sets up the first scene proper, in which we see a village full of wholesome Irish folk doing wholesome village things. When they see Pyre flying above them, they let out a cheer, which turns out to be premature because Pyre immediately attacks the village, chasing the villagers away with plumes of fire. It looks rubbish, obviously. Pyre flies with all the aerodynamic grace of a fridge being chucked in a skip, and the fire itself looks about as dangerous as warm custard. My favourite bit is the various farm animals who are completely indifferent to the dragon's attack, just going about their business as the villagers performatively scream and flee in terror. One guy falls into a pond as he runs from the dragon, and I do appreciate seeing someone fall into a body of water because I am at heart always about 12. We're only 90 seconds in, and the episode has already explained what the basic plot is. Something has gone wrong with the Dragon of Dare, who has started setting fire to villages. It's an intriguing premise for an episode, and delivered very strongly with the minimum of fuss. Of course, this being a kids' show, we do need to have the premise properly spelled out, so we immediately cut to King Conovar's court, where a group of villagers are angrily protesting about the dragon's rampage of destruction. One of the villagers, Galen, who will become important later, is also the most Irish man I think I've seen in the show so far. He's got a head like an albino pumpkin, and the hair and beard of someone who knows their way around an accordion. Rowan enters and angrily pushes his way through what I'm generously going to call the throng. Conovar demands to know what's up with the dragon, and Rowan doesn't know, but hints that the villagers were probably asking for it somehow. Conovar instructs Rowan to pacify the dragon, and Rowan agrees, but does rather passive-aggressively point out that Pyre is a wild beast, not some trained dog. Conovar acknowledges this and the contribution Pyre has made to the war effort, but warns Rowan that if Pyre cannot be controlled, then he will be forced to take action. This, again, is very efficient storytelling. We've got the stakes of the story clearly spelled out, and highlighted that Rowan has some divided loyalties between the fealty he owes the king and his affection for Pyre. It's also refreshing to see a leader responding so forcefully to a crisis. If this were to happen in the UK in 2026, the dragon would be on the Today programme to allow it to express its legitimate concerns about things not being on fire, and Keir Starmer would be dealing with the problem by announcing that the government is planning a crackdown on villagers. Rowan stalks out to the courtyard, where Deirdre, Angus and Ivar are waiting for him. They discuss the situation, which is grim, and Angus asks Rowan whether his connection with Pyre offers him any insight into the beast's behaviour. It does not. Rowan says he does feel a connection with Pyre, which keeps the possibility that he's doing a sex at a dragon in play, which is a nice callback to a couple of episodes ago, when it seemed very clear that they wanted us to think Pyre and Rowan were definitely more than just good chums. It's pretty obvious that Maeve is the most likely villain behind Pyre's sudden heel turn, but Deirdre isn't sure how simple sorcery could control a powerful beast like Pyre. This is a classic bit of fantasy nonsense. It's an example of something that crops up in any series which contains a powerful MacGuffin with poorly defined parameters, whether that be magic, superpowers, Star Trek technobabble, or the Doctor's sonic screwdriver. You will frequently end up in a situation where the MacGuffin is the most obvious answer, and you don't want it to be the obvious answer. Once Buffy the Vampire Slayer had raised someone from the dead, it was then necessary to explain why that couldn't be done for everyone who subsequently died in the show. See also the various Superman stories where he loses his powers, because his powers would make whatever situation the writers had come up with trivially easy to extricate himself from. Here, the writers are forced to come up with a reason why the obvious answer, that Maeve simply cast a magic spell, isn't something the group should be looking into. The problem is they haven't really come up with any rules about how magic works. Maeve has shown a variety of magical powers, including non-consensual teleportation, astral projection, the summoning of weirdly inebriated-seeming monsters, bit of pyromancy, and so on and so forth. She is able to magically do whatever the script needs her to magically do, and that is absolutely fine. The problem is that it's very clear that this is the case. There's really no rules, and that makes coming up with a convincing reason why it couldn't just be a magical spell controlling Pyre quite hard. When Deirdre says it's hard to imagine anyone being able to control Pyre with simple sorcery, it sounds faintly bizarre because we've seen Maeve do all manner of crazy stunts with her magical powers. Controlling a dragon definitely doesn't seem beyond the realms of possibility. In an ideal world, you would have shown Pyre being immune to Maeve's magic in a previous episode, but we don't live in an ideal world, as the fact that you're listening to me get increasingly into the weeds of a show aimed at 9-year-olds clearly demonstrates. I do have a point to this digression, because, having gone out of its way to state that it can't be magic, this then raises all kinds of interesting questions about what might actually be going on with Pyre to make him go all murdery. Could he be pining for an actual dragon mate and taking his feelings out on the world? Could someone in one of the villages be a proper wrong'un, and he's been trying to do Conovar a solid favour, which just so happens to come with a regrettable amount of collateral damage? has Maeve discovered that dragons will believe almost anything if you put it in a Daily Mail column? Stay tuned, because the answer, when it comes, may shock you. What the Mystic Knights really need is some form of clue, and Deirdre helpfully remembers that there was an attack on a northern outpost just a few days before Pyre started going postal. Perhaps there was some connection between this oddly remote battle and Pyre's condition. There's a wounded soldier from the outpost in the castle, and the knights hurry off to question him. The soldier tells them that Torque, Queen Maeve's unctuous general, led the assault personally, and that the Temra forces were only interested in securing a plant from the valley. This would appear to be another clue. The knights are now presented with an interesting dilemma. They need to find out about this mysterious plant, but they also need to curtail Pyre's inflammatory rampage. Rowan decides that they must divide their efforts, with Deirdre and Angus heading to the valley in search of the plant, and he and Ivar heading off north to try and reason with the fire-breathing dragon. It's now necessary to check in with Maeve in a scene that is trying to show that Maeve is definitely responsible for Pyre going loco, but which tries to preserve a degree of mystery about the actual specific process. We open with Maeve explaining to a group of mute underlings that everything is going really well thanks to her new ally, and then Torque pops up to say his spies have discovered the knights are abroad and heading north, which Maeve correctly interprets as a sign that Rowan is off to have a chat with his unstable dragon chum. Torque might not be good at much, but it has to be said his spy network is second to none. It's a plot device that's very handy for a lazy writer with only 20 minutes to play with, since it allows Maeve to respond to literally anything that the knights might do. In this case, she decides that she's going to arrange a warm welcome for the knights, and does this by casting a spell which carries an image of her to Pyre. On arrival, she tells Pyre that Rowan is a fake Draganta, that he's taking advantage of Pyre, and that the most sensible course of action is to destroy him, and also all of Kells. This is quite neatly written, since it does suggest the possibility that all Maeve is doing is popping up from time to tell Pyre a few well-chosen porky pies. This would tell us something useful about Pyre, that he's powerful, but fairly dim, and easily led into indulging his baser dragon nature, if you can give him something that sounds like a reasonable excuse for setting fire to things and eating the odd villager. It's probably not important that appearing as a ghostly figure in Pyre's cave is definitely Maeve using sorcery, despite what Deirdre said about it definitely not being sorcery. It's also not important that the animation is absolutely not up to delivering the reaction shot from Pyre that the script called for, and so instead we just get a shot of Pyre's head doing stuff for a couple of seconds. The key thing is that we've set up that Rowan is going to get the kind of reception normally reserved for Jehovah's Witnesses and people canvassing for the Labour Party. We now get a little scene of Ivar and Rowan travelling north, and for the first time in the series, they're actually riding horses, which does make them look proper fancy. I wonder if they were taking riding lessons from the first episode, and this is the first time they've been actually good enough in the saddle to make it work on screen. Much like getting out of a car at the start of a scene in a show with a modern setting, the presence of a horse does suggest the idea of travel better than having the characters just standing around in a field apropos of nothing. The scene is just an excuse for Rowan to complain about how difficult it is being the specialist boy in the whole wide world. Interestingly, rather than just give him a slap and tell him to get over himself, Ivar tells him that he believes in him, and so does everyone else. One of the weird things about this episode is that our quartet of main characters feel oddly serious and honestly a little depressed. Rowan is professionally dull and Ivar is usually depicted as the serious one, but Angus seems notably less flippant and Deirdre doesn't seem to have the energy to get properly furious about things like she usually would. With no sign of Aideen or Kingfin Vara of Tir na Nog in this episode, there's the distinct shortage of anything resembling whimsy or fun beyond that one villager falling in a pond. The dialogue is largely functional, simply propelling the plot forward, but never really coming to life, and the impression I'm left with is that the Mystic Knights are trying to save the day whilst simultaneously dealing with the after effects of an ill-advised lock-in the night before. This would explain why Rowan and Ivar can't face walking to Pyre's cave. Speaking of Pyre, he briefly interrupts Ivar and Rowan's team talk by flying overhead. He's just got back from setting fire to some more stuff, and Ivar and Rowan encounter some refugees as they follow Pyre back to his lair, as a helpful reminder of the stakes of the story and the cost borne by ordinary people in these tales of magical adventure. The tension gets ratcheted up further in the next scene, in which a slightly singed man comes to beg King Conovar for aid as his village too has been incinerated. This is an opportunity for Galen, the pumpkin-headed villager from earlier, to demand to allow him and his cronies the opportunity to slay the dragon. Reluctantly, Conovar agrees, and this adds a further complication to the knight's mission. Not only must they get Pyre back under control, but at the same time they're going to have to defend the dragon from the murderous intentions of a man made entirely out of ham. Continuing the gloomy mood, Deirdre and Angus arrive at the destroyed outpost the wounded soldier spoke of. Deirdre manages to summon up the energy to get a little bit ticked off by it, and Angus points out the Temra patrol in the valley. Deirdre has a cunning plan, which is to kick the shit out of them. A plan which Angus fully endorses, setting the scene for one of Mystic Knight's classic awkward fight scenes. I'm becoming something of an expert on badly choreographed fights in fields at this point. This one opens with Deirdre and Angus stepping out from behind a tree to surprise the patrol. I genuinely have no idea how they can possibly have got behind the tree without being spotted. The area does have other trees they could have used as cover, but there is a lot of open ground between them, and a river on one side severely limits the hero's options for stealthily approaching. It's probably not important, but it is the sort of thing that does gently bug me. This is also another classic Mystic Knights ambush, in that Deirdre and Angus leap from their hiding place, loudly announce themselves, and then politely wait for everyone to get themselves sorted out before going into action. Deirdre does the kick that actress Lisa Dwan has more or less perfected at this point, and Angus grabs a spear that's being held by a soldier and uses it as a kind of fulcrum to swing the unfortunate warrior into another group of warriors. It's very much the sort of wildly unconvincing set 2 we've got used to seeing on this show, and it's followed by another standard bit of action as the leader of the Temra soldiers rallies his forces, only for Deirdre to knock them all over with her wind-producing crossbow thing. And this leads to them immediately panicking and running away in terror. I think we could all agree falling over isn't great, but I don't think it's quite the fight-ending manoeuvre that the Mystic Knights seem to think it is. I once drunkenly fell into a ha-ha at a wedding reception, and it didn't make me flee the wedding in terror. On the contrary, once I picked myself up, I went straight back to tackling the buffet, and let me tell you, that was an intimidating buffet. I'm not saying I'm braver than a professional soldier, but I did eat about 11 onion bhajis in one sitting, and I think that says a lot. With the soldiers gone, Angus and Deirdre are able to secure samples of the plant they were gathering. They don't recognise it, but Deirdre, very sensibly, suggests taking it to the Druid Cahad, this sort of thing being absolute core Druid shit. We now cut back to Rowan and Ivar, who have finally made their way into Pyre's lair. Pyre doesn't seem particularly pleased to see them, and also significantly smaller than the last time we saw him. Setting fire to all those villages apparently takes it out of you. Ivar has a cunning plan, which is that they should shoot Pyre with his magical trident, which is an unusual way to try and get a recalcitrant ally back on side, but Rowan prefers a more subtle approach of simply hectoring the dragon into seeing the error of his ways. I can only speak for myself, but I don't think my response to being shot or shouted at would be to suggest we go out for dinner together like old times. Maeve pops up by magic, again, to suggest a different approach to Pyre, which is ignoring Rowan's lies and destroying him. Of the three, she's probably made the most persuasive argument, and the free and frank exchange of views ends with Ivar and Rowan crouching behind a rock while Pyre breathes fire at them. Ivar suggests summoning their magical armour, but Rowan demurs for reasons. Obviously, the real reason is that they need to preserve the idea that donning the magical armour represents the characters powering up significantly, and that's going to be undermined if the script still needs them to cower behind a rock for 10 minutes. Rowan's stated reason is that putting on the armour will only make Pyre angrier, but I think there's a threshold beyond which making someone angrier ceases to be super relevant, and I think that threshold is a way below the point at which someone is trying quite hard to immolate you. Rowan decides that the only sensible course of action is retreat, which involves both he and Ivar shooting Pyre with their magical weapons on the way out, but not hard or anything, just enough to buy time to escape. Now, I can speak with a degree of authority here because, in addition to an undergraduate degree in history with education studies, I also have a postgraduate diploma in psychology and a master's degree in forensic psychology. So you can trust me when I tell you that the vast majority of people, across a wide range of backgrounds, will be more angered by being shot at than by watching someone put on a plastic set of armour. There will obviously be some cases where the sight of a man in weird clobber will be more enraging than guns, but those people are entirely mental, and unless Pyre is spending his free time protesting drag queen story time, I think being shot at is probably, to use a technical term, going to get right on his tits, even if Rowan is shouting, "Don't listen to her, Pyre," at the same time as shooting bolts of fire directly into his face. Maeve's plan seems to be going gangbusters at the moment. We pause to check in on Galen's plan. He's built a genuinely massive crossbow with which to hunt the dragon, so that's nice. It's a pretty impressive bit of kit, but it does look a mite rickety for a siege engine. I think I'd want to be a safe distance away from anyone deploying this particular ballista in anger, but it's a nice bit of effort to go to for a subplot and does visually indicate that Galen means serious business. Elsewhere inside the castle, Angus and Deirdre are having a confab with Cahad. He identifies the plant as Dragon's Bane, which is said to have a profound effect on dragons, rendering them susceptible to influence and suggestion. Here's the thing. A magical plant that can influence dragons is not technically sorcery, but it is extremely sorcery adjacent, and I had hoped, naively, that when Deirdre insisted that sorcery wouldn't work, that was an indication that Maeve's scheme wouldn't turn out to be 3 underage spells in a trench coat and a false moustache trying to get into an adults-only botany conference. But alas, it turns out I was wrong. The bad news is that Cahad has no idea if he can create an antidote to Maeve's magical Mickey Finn, but the good news is that the format of the show will break if he can't, so we are in pretty safe hands. We have a very, very brief check-in on Maeve, and once again, General Torque's spies have come up with the goods, and he has learned that the Mystic Knights know about the Dragon's Bane. Maeve doesn't see it as a huge issue, given that Pyre is still under her control, and she has a point, to be fair. She's no more idea that Cahad is definitely going to come up with an antidote than Cahad himself does within the context of the fiction. Meanwhile, back at Pyre's lair, Ivar and Rowan's plan doesn't seem to be working especially well. "I've never seen him so angry," says Rowan, which is further evidence against the theory that shooting at people is a good way to calm them down. Ivar points out that they may have to change tactics somewhat if they don't want to be roasted alive. Looking on the bright side, Rowan points out that at least if Pyre is trying to kill and eat them, he's not trying to kill and eat anyone else. All they can hope to do is survive long enough for Angus and Deirdre to come up with some kind of solution. The stakes are raising nicely, and it's pleasing to see Rowan definitively on the back foot and needing to rely on others to save the day. Their cowering behind a rock is suddenly interrupted by Galen, who runs in to lob a couple of spears at Pyre while shouting at him. This too doesn't exactly soothe the dragon, but in all fairness Galen's motives are rather simpler in that he wants to kill Pyre rather than somehow stab him into a better mood. After pulling a spear from his flank, Pyre takes to the air, and Rowan grabs Galen and pulls him into the dubious safety of the layer's best cowering rock, as Pyre flies out of the cave and out into the heath beyond, where several of Galen's cronies are loading the very large and rickety ballista from earlier. Rowan is less than impressed with Galen, who counters that he's on the king's business. Rowan says he's also on the king's business, and it has to be said it is an oversight on the part of King Conovar not to dispatch Galen's mob with a signed order instructing Rowan to calm down. I assume Rowan can read, given that his original job was assistant to Cahad the Druid, who seems like a literate sort. Facing a dragon without their mystical armour is one thing, but there's a group of traumatised farmers to deal with as well, and so Rowan decides that if they're going to deal with both problems, then they will, at last, need to get suited and booted. Strapping on the riot gear to deal with a group of farmers who aren't even interested in them is proof that ACAB also applies to Mystic Knights. If one of the farmers was wearing a t-shirt that said "I support Palestine action," I'm sure Ivar would electrocute him without a second thought. What follows is a baffling ruck, as Rowan and Ivar scuffle with the farmers whilst also trying to protect them from Pyre's attacks and Pyre from their attacks. It's got a real fight outside of Wetherspoons vibe to it, which makes it absolutely hilarious to me. I think it's because they don't want to show Rowan and Ivar going all out against a group of men who aren't technically their enemies. There's quite a lot of shoving and rolling about on the floor, and when Angus and Deirdre rock up, I half expected her to open by yelling, "Leave it, Rowan! He's not worth it!" while waving a bottle of Bacardi Breezer. Also, I've just looked up Bacardi Breezer, and it turns out they stopped making it in 2015, and I'm so old that even my references to Alco-Pops are dated. At the point at which Angus and Deirdre appear, and immediately don their armour to lend a hand, both Ivar and Rowan seem to be getting the stuffing knocked out of them, which is an odd way to position them. Okay, it is 3 burly farmers against 2, but even so you'd think that the fabled warrior Draganta and a prince from overseas would have the martial chops to take on 3 fellas who look like their barber had a personal grudge against them. Between the 4 of them, they managed to subdue the farmers. Angus, who apparently didn't get the memo about using minimum force, literally smacks one of them in the spine with his ball and chain. He does love attempting to actually murder people, that lad. Beating up farmers might be fun, but the dragon is still the real problem, and fortunately Angus and Deirdre have brought the solution with them in the form of a magic potion that might break Maeve's hold over Pyre. At this point, for very unclear reasons, a second fight breaks out between the heroes and the farmers, which ends with Ivar gently knocking the big crossbow with his trident, and the crossbow immediately falling over. Maeve pops up for one last reminder that she's the actual baddie in this story, not the trio of men trying to prevent any more farms being burned. She urges Pyre to further acts of mindless carnage, while Rowan distracts the dragon by once again repeatedly shooting him in the face with bolts of magical fire from his sword. This provides an opening for Deirdre to use her crossbow to fling the bottle of potion up to Pyre, who swallows it without a second thought and is immediately cured, much to Maeve's frustration. There's a nice bit where the now restored Pyre sends a blast of fire at Maeve's avatar, and we cut back to Maeve in her castle, dropping her wand, which has become too hot to hold. I do quite like that. With Pyre now back on the team, Rowan smugly tells Galen and the others that if they want to kill Pyre, they'll have to go through him. Galen doesn't seem best pleased, referring to the knights as dragon lovers and traitors before stalking off with his mates. It's good to see that he's not remotely changed his mind about Pyre, and I think there would have been scope for making him something of a recurring antagonist to the group. Having someone nominally on the same side who hates the main characters is often a handy narrative device to have in your back pocket. Sadly, this is his only appearance in the show, which feels like a missed opportunity. We get one final scene to wrap things up in which Galen is having a bit of a whinge to King Conovar, and Ivar and Deirdre underline the fact that Pyre is now under Rowan's control once more, and besides, it was all Maeve's fault. Galen quite reasonably brings up the enormous damage that Pyre has caused, and Conovar tells him that the royal treasury will bear the cost of putting everything back as it was. I bet they'll be so efficient that next time we see the village there'll be no indication whatsoever that half of it was burned down. There's no mention made of the taxation implications of King Conovar's apparent largesse. If the coffers are to be emptied to rebuild half of Kells, I'm guessing he's going to want them refilled at some point, and the only way of doing that will be to tax the farmers he's claiming to help. Never trust a rich guy who claims they're going to pay for stuff. They're always intending to get it back later. There's only one thing left to do, and that's for Conovar to remind Rowan that despite everything, he's still the specialist boy who ever lived. It's increasingly aggravating that not only is the show always determined to remind us that Rowan is the best, it's also decided that he's insecure about it, and therefore no characters will ever miss an opportunity to remind him of just how wonderful he truly is. It's a strange episode in that when I think about it in the abstract, I quite like it. Pyre apparently turning on Kells is a strong threat, dividing the knights in a race against time to keep Pyre occupied long enough for Deirdre and Ivar to find a solution gives the story plenty of urgency. The addition of a second threat from Galen and his mates adds a welcome twist into the mix. That's all great. It's really good functional storytelling. But actually watching this episode was less fun than some of the far less competently structured ones we've seen. I think my issue is that there's just not enough weirdness to it. Because the script is so efficient, there's not much scope for an odd subplot or the knights bickering with one another. The characterisation is muted. They're all recognisably themselves, but the tone is just unusually serious. I never thought I'd say it, but I actually missed seeing King Finvara or a deem, who can be relied on to inject something uncomfortable and bizarre into the story. Dragon's Fury is technically one of the more accomplished bits of storytelling in the show so far, but it's all just a little bit clinical. I don't dislike it so much as find it solid. Solid is fine, but it isn't all that interesting to think about afterwards. Having said that, I've clearly thought about this to the tune of 5,500 words, so it can't be all that bad. That is all for this episode. Next time we'll be watching Tyrone, or Tirune, or Tiroon, an episode with a title that's just a made-up word. According to my unified theory of sci-fi and fantasy naming conventions, when an episode just has the name of a character, it usually means the authors don't really know what the episode is actually about, thematically speaking. See also adding the suffix of death to an episode title. Anyway, I'll very much hope to be proved wrong, and I do hope you will join me for that. If you are enjoying this podcast, why not consider supporting me on Patreon so that I'm morally obligated to continue doing it? As little as a single English quid gets you a bunch of gaming materials I've written over the years and the warm glow of knowing that this is all somehow your fault. All support is deeply appreciated. You can also leave a rating or a review if you like, that would help too, or simply tell a friend who you think might enjoy this sort of thing. You can get in touch with me via email at hjdoomretrofun, or one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. Popular Antiquarian is a production of Doom Industries. Thank you very much for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.